I apologize that I do not speak your beautiful language. I understand it. Ich verstehe es schon. Ich kann es ein bisschen sprechen, aber das würde so langsam sein und langweilig werden. Immer dieselben Wörter. Also spreche ich dann lieber auf Englisch. Aber wenn es Fragen gibt, dann kann ich das schon handeln. Thank you very much for the invitation to the three organizers. There you are too. And I am delighted that you're doing this series. It looks fantastic, I must say. So I want to cover several subjects. I will speak slowly, and because I'm a foreigner in English, I'm told that it's easier to understand me than a Brit. The British are impossible, or an American. So I'm just trying to give it a very positive slant. And I want to cover several subjects. I want to start with the current moment, but then I also want to move, and I will use partly the United States, partly Europe, to illustrate sort of the complexities about the migrant question. It's not simple. Many citizens of today were migrants a generation ago. I always like to say that Europe, I'm Dutch, ich bin eine Holländerin, also that we in Europe, we are a Creole people. Now you know that Creole doesn't quite fit into the European, but we are really mixed. There is no way that, that nationality somehow kept isolated. We are truly mixed. So I just want to cover, now I want to start with today's condition. And here is my take. I'm just going to give to you very briefly, and then I'll begin to elaborate. I think that what we are witnessing in these migrations that have suddenly come online, so to say, though the reasons for migrating may have been older, I think we're witnessing a new phase in the long history of migrations in Europe. And I think it's not just Europe, it's just that Europe is the biggest, the most visible event. I'm also looking at the migrations of minors, unaccompanied minors, the youngest 8 years old, who have traveled from Guatemala, Honduras, and Salvador to the United States. We know that over 100,000 made it. We do not know how many died, how many were kidnapped, etc. And the Rohingya in Myanmar, an old Muslim population that had been quite integrated, who now suddenly are persecuted. And you have Buddhist monks, a certain group of them, who are justifying killing them. That does not go with Buddhist. So strange things, extreme moments. I would say that what we see coming into Europe also has extreme moments. It's not all extreme, but there are very extreme moments. I would say they're sufficiently extreme that they at least invite us to ask whether the standard ways in which we have analyzed and produced knowledge about migration is still the most useful way of understanding what is happening. The migrant, the immigrant, is a strong subject. She knows that she wants something. She knows that she can get it done. Many of the people that we see fleeing, whether that is from Asia, various Asian zones, or from sub-Saharan Africa, they are more like refugees, even when they are being classified as migrants. The refugee is pushed out. The refugee is not necessarily strong. So I want to come back to the migrant. The migrant historically is a subject, an actor, who leaves a home behind. The refugee often doesn't. There is nothing left. And she thinks maybe of going back to that home. And she thinks, how can she strengthen? She wants to make sure that what she leaves behind grows, expands, is positive. So they send money. We know all of that. There is a lot of data about that. My take, the hypothesis that I'm looking at, is that today what we are seeing and classifying as migrants are refugees of a different sort. We have used the term refugee to link it with war. These are different refugees, but they're refugees. They're not migrants. There is no home left to go back to. Home is a plantation. Home is a mine. This is not the war zones I'm speaking about. I'm speaking about those who do not fit the war logic, for which we have a regime that recognizes that they have been pushed out by war. What I see happening also in these migrations to Europe is a second kind of flow. They are refugees of sort. They are just not linked to war. They are linked to a massive loss of habitat back home. And in this latest book that Fischer Verlag just put out in German, I examine a lot of the ways in which that loss of habitat is happening. So we have, for instance, almost 300 million hectares of land in the global south, a lot of it in Africa, certain parts of Asia, certain parts of Latin America, acquired by about 15 governments and by about 100 plus firms. When that happens, there is a lot of expelling of people. Whole villages now are a plantation or a space where they grab water. There is a lot of water grabbing. Like Nestle and Coca-Cola, they go around the world. Are you understanding my English or not? Oh, good, good, good. So they go around the world and they go getting water. Those beautiful bottles, that takes surprise. Though you probably in Germany, you use Quellen, nicht wahr? That is different from, but you know what I'm talking about. So when you put a lot of these conditions together, what you see is a whole variety of people being expelled from their land. But there is no regime. When the refugee from war, from Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, when he or she appears at the border, there is a way in which the law can recognize her and him because they're refugees. There is a regime. When people come from areas of the world where they just simply have been expelled because the mines have taken over, because the plantations have taken over, because a lot of the land has been poisoned by the mining way past, way beyond where the actual mine is, they are invisible in their full materiality. That body is invisible to the law. There is no claim they can make. They cannot invoke a regime. So it depends a bit on the authorities. Well, should we or should we not take them in? And they do not come from war zones. So one of my efforts right now is to emphasize the importance that we need to recognize, and hence we need a regime vis-à-vis mining corporations, vis-à-vis the plantations developments, etc., so that we can recognize them. And again, I want to come back to this image, which is very strong. It's an image I will return to when I speak about undocumented migrants, that when in their full body, they are invisible to the law. I mean, they're visible to these eyes, but there is no regime that covers them. So the notion for me is that we should have a regime that says mines, plantations, climate change, which means that much land today is either water or desert, also expelling people, that we have to develop instruments, legal instruments, to recognize them. So otherwise now they depend on whatever explanation they can give and whatever interpretation that explanation is given. So this is, to me, an extremely serious sense. So in that sense, what we're now classifying still as migrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa, coming from certain parts of Asia, but it's mostly really sub-Saharan Africa in the case of Europe, they are refugees. They're just a new type of refugee. In my reading, we're going to have more and more of this. Just the expansion of cities is producing displacements. The expansion of all kinds of agriculture is producing dead land very quickly. Plantations kill the land very quickly. So they're going to need more and more land. So the image that I see is an escalating of these very acute conditions, acute, not cute, acute. And we lack instruments to do this. So I'm part of a group who are trying to call attention to this. And it also fits, of course, with the whole question of environmental destruction. Now, it seems to me that, and here I want to go digging a bit into the figure of the immigrant and the citizen. And there is a kind of ambiguity in some senses. For instance, many citizens in our countries, maybe not in Germany, but certainly in the United States, they might as well be illegitimate the way they get treated by the police, the United States is a bit extreme. You must have heard a bit about the ease with which police just shoot somebody dead, even if he's 12 years old, and because he had a plastic toy gun. Have people heard of this? Are people aware? I mean, it's so extreme. But that is just the most visible and most dramatic moment. There are many, there are actually many moments when a lot of our citizens are subjected to treatments that, what does it mean to be a citizen? Another one is, I'm just mentioning a few data, a few items. Under Bush, former President Bush, a new regime was implemented that was part of national security, etc., which meant that the Attorney General of the United States, I don't know, wie heißt man das auf Deutsch, Attorney General? Okay, you heard it, right? Because too many, all right. The Attorney General was authorized to violate the law of the land, so to say, because it was under, emergency law. And so one thing that happened was that over 200,000 Latino immigrants, many of whom were citizens, they were already citizens, many of whom had the regular documents as immigrants, and some of them may not have been, they were put in jail. And they have been kept there. Most of them are still there. So this is a long time. This is years. And one little move on the part of the government, the authorities, whatever, kept them there. And that was that they were not given a hearing with a judge to demonstrate, I'm a citizen, or I'm a regular immigrant. They were captured. They didn't always carry. I don't carry my passport when I am, where I live. I'm sure you don't carry your passport with you in Germany all the time. So they didn't have their papers. But they were not given a hearing. I'm always impressed with how the law enables a very small, little non-action that can be absolutely devastating. So the case of the United States is extreme, but the point that I'm trying to make that even citizens, and I don't know, you know about Germany, even regular citizens who may have come to the country from another country or maybe second generation are not always protected. So I'm beginning to interrogate this distinction between immigrant and citizen. Now, part of the story there, and I will not develop that very much, is something that I have talked about a lot, which is how are more and more of the citizens, certainly in the United States, but I understand also a bit in Europe, we're losing rights. We're losing sort of privileges perhaps that we once had. Something is shifting. There is more and more unemployment, etc. So this is a very special epoch. So on the one hand, what I said about those who are expelled from their land, not by war, but by economic actors who are very powerful and very damaging. On the other hand, inside of our countries, there is a bit of ambiguity in terms of the rights we're losing. I in the United States, I've been tracking the rights that we, the citizens, are losing. That is why I want to talk about immigrants and citizens because... So here I want to tell you a little story. Some of you may know my husband, Richard Sennett, who really knows how to write, unlike me, you know, he's a beautiful writer. And so he's always saying that I need a hobby. And I remember, this was way back when, quite a while ago, when a piece of law was passed that was about immigrants. So experts on citizenship never bothered to look at it. I was working on both citizens and immigrants. I looked at it. And in that immigration law was a clause that took away a right from us citizens, which was the right to go to a lower order court and launch an action, you know, on behalf of immigrants. Are you still with me? Right? We lost that right. We cannot do that anymore. Now, this happened under Clinton, President, the first Clinton. It looks like we're going to have a new Clinton. I mean, we don't have kings and queens, but we almost sort of might as well. Really, is there nobody else that we could think of? Evidently not. And so I did go to my husband, Richard Sennett, and I said, Richard, I have a hobby. I am counting all the rights we're losing. And he, of course, said, that's not a hobby. But anyhow, so I'm pretty hardcore here. So the point here is that we as citizens are not as strong as we were, you know, in terms of vis-à-vis the law as we were maybe, you know, in the decades after World War II in the West, were strong decades. Mind you, we had capitalism, but it was a capitalism that gained from us making more and more money, our children doing better than we did. That is gone. That capitalism is not with us. We have a more extractive capitalism. And, you know, when just as an aside to create a context for this notion that immigrants and citizens are both losing something. I mean, the decades after World War II into the 1980s were decades where the dominant law, it was capitalism. And there were some very selfish, you know, actors in there and destructive logics. But the dominant logic was centered on mass consumption, which meant that the system gained from us consuming, from us having incomes, from government supporting us with social, you know, the medical studies, etc., etc. That is gone. And so I say that now we have shifted to an epoch dominated by a logic of extraction. And it's so like mining. Mining is extractive. Once the mine is done, once you have finished extracting, you leave it. You move on. Finance, very different from traditional banking. Finance is extractive. So a lot, I don't know if you are aware, but in the UK, in the US, and a bit in Germany, about 1 million households in Germany, a household can have one person, 2, 3, were subjected to a certain kind of instrument of finance, which meant that they all wound up losing their homes. So in Germany, it's an invisible story. I'm sure that many of you are not aware of this. But over 1 million households fell into that sort of trap, bought that instrument, so to say, and they're going to lose their home or they've already lost it. In the United States, it's 14 million households, which is like at least 30 million individuals out. Invisible story. Again, part of the story here for me is always how the material can be so invisible. Now, I'm mentioning all of these things that affect citizens because I'm really interested in not making a big difference, the immigrant, the citizen, and the citizen somehow is protected. I want to argue that this is a very ambiguous story. And I also think that a new logic of capitalism, as I said, a logic of extraction rather than mass consumption, has set in. It really starts in the last 20 years, in some places in the last 30 years already in the United States. So when we talk about immigrants and citizens, it's not as clear a separation. Now, I want to, so as I say here, what are the architectures for membership that we need to think about? What are other ways of thinking membership? And also the notion that a lot of those who are not recognized as citizens, who are not citizens, have actually sort of informal social, what do I say here, social contracts. And at the other extreme, citizenship is becoming devalued. You see what I'm doing, right? That in some ways, some immigrants can have supports, and at the same time, totally different worlds, though. Citizens are losing ground. So it's a bit wobbly. And so so the subjects here are an immigrant who begins to approximate a citizen who begins to lose rights, and then these new types of migrants who are really coming because of loss of habitat, not because they want a better life, etc., but there is not much left for them. The total number, by the way, that we can estimate, this is a footnote, of people who are losing habitat, every year, millions and millions. They're not migrating yet, but they might. Do you understand? This is an invisible history that is being made year after year. We're talking millions and millions every year. And I want to just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So new cities are being built. Cities are getting expanded. Corporate office parks are being built. This is mostly in the global south. It all displaces people. And the people they displace are not people who have a strong claim or a contract to say, this is my land, my family has had it, for a century or whatever. So that is one issue. Then already what I mind, the mining, the plantations, and the climate change. But there are multiple factors at work here. And governments are selling land to, selling or whatever, a contract for long-term exploitation. This is not in the war zone. This is in the non-war zone. And they are selling land for exploitation to all kinds of companies and operations. Now, when that happens, the statistics for that economy register as, this is good, there is growth. Invisible is this expulsion of people from land that they have owned. So I'm just hoping that you can see this broader set of emergent conditions that we haven't quite documented well enough, that we haven't quite, managed to sort of sort out. Now, let me then move into this kind of, again, the ambiguity between the citizen and the immigrant. So, this is all English. Can you see it? All right. Pardon? Yeah? I know. But, you might not know that it is English. In some countries, they wouldn't know that this is English. It really is so. Now, whether you understand is another matter. But so one first thing that I want to do is to navigate a bit the question of the migrant, this evolving figure. It's not always the same. And I love taking one nationality. Now, in the case of the United States, the Chinese migrants are an extraordinary changing figure. They have been there for 200 years, and they are changing. So you have the Chinese who were basically sort of, they were almost like slaves, building the railroads, etc. The Chinese who then set up commerce in the cities. And now you have very rich Chinese who buy the right to be residents or even citizens. They just give a lot of money. So when you say the Chinese migration, in the case of the United States, it's a very ambiguous term. And I'm sure you have the equivalent here in Germany, right? That this notion that a given nationality can go through multiple transformations, but still might be stuck like Turkish migrants. A lot of the Turkish people who have moved to Germany are super rich. But the Turkish migrant, They come out of this new epoch, you know, that the current president has launched. But the notion is that Turkish migrant is still a very strong image. So I'm trying to destabilize very traditional ways in which we might understand a migrant from a given nationality. All right? And then yes, okay, so I already said that. So here is an example of the sharp increase in the rate of deportation. So here we're talking about yet another kind of migration, right? Undocumented and imprisonment of documented Mexican immigrants, which I just mentioned to you. So this is a change, I'm just repeating here, a change in national law here, there, national law, see there in the middle there, allowing states, subnational states like your Länder, to pass their own kinds of laws. This is against national sovereign law, but it was allowed because we had a state of emergency. So in the Arizona, which borders with Mexico, the Arizona government could do basically what they wanted. This is a violation of law, but insofar as we live under a state of security, I think in Germany you have a partial state of security, don't you, national security? Which allows the government also to take measures that violate the law. I think you have a mini little state of security, but it's very unpleasant, even if it's mini. Huh? So in the United States, we live under a state of security. For instance, just to give you an example, I can receive a letter from my government telling me, as of now, you're under observation. You cannot tell anyone that you have received this letter. You cannot tell your lawyer. You cannot tell your wife, your husband. You and I, the government, know this. Nobody else knows. You know what that means? Silence. Like that. It's amazing. This is the United States. So we live under a partial state of security. And what does that mean? That allows the government to violate its own laws. Now, I mention this, just this is the most extreme case, okay? I mention this to signal this that what we really need is transversal solidarities. The immigrant is not the enemy. Often, you know, the problematic condition is power. And most immigrants do not have power. So it depends a bit on how power gets used. So just going on here. Now, I want to give you an example of what happened in the United States, which is really quite extraordinary. And it's sort of a new landscape that begins to emerge when we go into the state of security. A lot of Europe is also, I repeat, under a partial state of security, whether people are aware of that or not. So we basically have reduced the entry of Mexican immigrants to almost zero. This is something that most Americans are not aware of. Maybe you are all aware of that. Mexican migration is at zero, basically. They are no longer coming. The notion, however, the language, when you hear politicians speak, that we are invaded. And this goes back, so this really goes back to quite a few years, but we have no more Mexican immigration. What is happening is Guatemala, Honduras, and Salvador. They are coming from there. And it is also these children, unaccompanied children. I'll return to that. Now, I want to just look at these figures. This is the build-up, bits and pieces of a wall, whether it's a visible wall or an invisible wall, that created a border where no Mexicans are coming through, basically. All right? So it took money, it took training. It succeeded. It worked, basically. But one little irony, when the border was fluid, people would come, and many would just stay 3 or 4 months and then go back home. This happened, remember when Berlin, when the wall falls, you had people from Eastern Germany who would just come and work for 3 or 4 months in the West, and then they would basically still be living, you know, in their, like Polish, there's a famous studies of Polish women working in households. You know, when you can move back and forth, you often keep your home if it's close by and if it's sort of. So anyhow, what we did was we spent a lot of money on a wall that separates, and now those who are in the country, and we have about 12 million undocumented. That's a lot. You have heard a candidate, this extraordinary event that we call Mr. Trump. I mean, it's not even, it's an event, really. So he wants to expel the 12 million. You've heard this, right? Impossible. It's just not on, you know. But many of these people would be circulating, actually. This is quite a debate in the migration community, you know. Are we better off creating very strong walls, or are we better off leaving this fluidity? Because, of course, to many of them, if they live close to the border, it's advantageous to keep on living in Mexico. It's cheaper, etc. Anyhow, I just want to move on. But the point here that I'm making, we spent a lot of citizens' money, it's our taxes, after all, to create a wall. And now, you know, we have actually made the system more rigid and made all of us a bit more vulnerable in some sense. Now, Patriot Act is this terrible name, Patriot Act. Patriot is such a problematic term, really. I don't know, how do you say that in German, patriot? Patriot. All right. So I find it, I always notice this word. I don't know why. Maybe I'm Dutch. The Dutch are not particularly sort of sense of patriotism. It's just not us. But anyhow, so this Patriot Act, which is this law, the security law, which is still there, it enables all kinds of things. So it allows, what I say, the immediate deportation of anybody. If you look suspect, you know, you can just be. It's quite brutal. And again, I don't want to. Now, the other thing that we have, and again, I mention this because insofar as you have a mini state of security, what happens under those conditions is that the state can violate its own law. One instance that I want to pick up on is point number 2 here. In the United States, immigration is it's a federal subject. The states, the member, like the Länder, the equivalent of the Länder, they cannot make immigration law. Under Patriot Act, and this was, again, this starts with Bush, they were authorized, the states could just do whatever they wanted, because it was a way of promoting hatred against immigrants, etc., etc. It's a horrible story. So a lot of bills were passed, bills are low-level laws, were passed. You know, this is all in violation of national law. But that is what a state of security means, that at different levels you are authorizing. Now, of course, it still wants those workers, etc. I'm going to scroll over this because it's too much. Now, here I want to begin to talk about something that I've sort of developed this in order to distinguish people who are immigrants from the spaces within which they function. So when I ran away from home, and I go into the United States with $50 in my pocket, my family was living in Italy at that time. That was the second time I ran away from home. The first time I was 16, I ran away from Argentina. That was quite a trip I took. But this one was a bit more. I was already a bit older. I don't know, not that much older. Anyhow, so my first job was as a cleaning woman in the United States. Now, I came from a fairly bourgeois family, so it was partly adventure. But here is what I want to emphasize. So there was a whole bunch of other women. They were mostly Afro-Caribbean. And they were pretty highly educated. They were all older. I was pretty young. They were all older than I was. You know, they knew what they wanted. None of them, none of us, I was part of them, none of us thought that we simply were the space within which we were laboring. You understand what I'm saying, right? The space was just a working space. But we knew, cleaning woman, right? But we knew that that was not simply us. There is another example that I always like to mention. So I know quite a few Latin American immigrants who are undocumented, but they're trying to get their papers. And say one of them is a doctor, a medical doctor. He lives in a very poor immigrant community, and he works as a parking lot attendant. This is a story that goes back a bit. And then there are other people like that, you know. Now, a lawyer, same thing with a lawyer. So I say that what we need to, this is a footnote now, I hope you're still with me. So we need to, these low-income communities that have lots of immigrants, they need to get a sense of what are the knowledges present in their neighborhoods. So imagine there is a doctor living in a low-income community who cannot practice, a medical doctor, right? But he has the knowledge. Imagine, and especially in the United States where poor people have almost no access to medical service, you have to pay. Imagine that. We have a doctor, we have a lawyer. You get the picture, right? So this notion of distinguishing the space where the immigrant is that might devalue the humanity, if you want, of that immigrant versus who you are. So the space is immigrant from immigrant subjects, right? The immigrant subject is not the same as that immigrant space necessarily. This is typical. Most immigrants are fairly educated people. So the importance of recovering that. Now the other thing is the multiple immigration spaces that we have in today's world. And here I sort of list a few of these, right? They can be institutional, ideational, tactical, and they produce this migrant subject. I hope you're with me. So there is a new transnational class of professionals. They, in a way, are migrants too. But they function in a space that values them more perhaps than they should be valued. You know what I mean? Oh, they're international. They don't speak all these languages. Well, you know, they're migrants, basically. Then there is the contract labor worker, you know, who enters just for a few months every year under the law, etc., but a very devalued type of worker. The business visa immigrant. So in the United States, you can literally buy your visa. If you have, $40,000 in capital investment, you get a good, an enabling immigrant visa. I don't know what you do in Germany, but there is such a long list of options. And as I already mentioned today, the government will give you quasi-citizenship rights and certainly full immigrant status if you bring in X amount of money to invest in a firm. So who is the migrant? Who is that subject? These are questions. So then the family-dependent immigrant, we know what we're talking about. The green card immigrant is somebody who has actually a document that they get before they leave their country. The high-tech visa worker, Germany has given a lot of visa. It's a high-tech visa. It's a particular kind of visa to high-tech people. They have been competing. For a while there, they were really competing with other European countries because there is a limited supply of these high-tech types. So when we say the immigrant, we have actually eliminated a lot of these sort of fancier things, and we think of something that is down there, something that is struggling, that is poor, not very educated. That's also a mistake. We know that most of the people coming from Syria as refugees, highly educated people. We know that many of the people coming from Iraq and Afghanistan, highly educated people. So the language that we're using actually flattens all of these subjects into something, that I don't know that we gain from that. Now, here, this is another way of running it. The subject. Who's the subject? Well, the low-wage worker, the international businessman or woman, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to elaborate on all of this now. Now, another item that I think illuminates yet another feature of the migrant is the question of remittances. So there's a very strong notion, and I'm going to talk from the perspective of the United States, because it might vary from country to country, but I have the impression that it's also present beyond the United States. Let's put it that way. And here is the language. The language is, so here come these migrants. They work here. They make money here in the United States. And then they send it back home. You know the story. You know that the migrant remittances in some countries are really a very significant part of the economy. It's certainly the case, in some of the Latin American countries. Now, that creates a kind of negativity. The notion is they come to the United States, they earn money, and then they sent it back home, rather than, say, investing it in the United States. So here, I love this. Look at this. So this is the 20 remittance recipient countries. Now, we all know that India is one of those, China, but Mexico, very familiar. But look at that. The top 10 has, of course, several European countries, partly because, you know. So, but we don't think of that. That is not, when we say remittances, we're thinking mostly of low-wage workers who are sending it back home, not investing it. Are you with me? Do you understand what I'm saying, right? This is like a critique that is, so they make money here in the US, and then and the United States is among the top 20 remittance receiving countries. The point that I'm trying to make here is, again, we say remittances, we tend to think, I'm sure that you have a bit of that in Germany too, that, and then they work here and then they send it all back home instead of reinvesting it or doing something with it here. Well, you know, several European countries are among the top remittance receiving countries. These are, of course, the professionals. But we don't think of it. When you say remittances, people think low-wage workers sending their earnings back home. So these are all ways in which one begins to sort of rectify these very simplified versions. Now, this is more, right, I'm going to skip this. And, right, I'm going to also skip this and this. Well, here are a lot of very interesting datums about different types of countries, but I have to move on here. And these are the latest figures that we have into 2013. You can see some of the figures. You know, this is a growing number, a growing figure. The numbers of migrants are also growing, but it's still a very small portion of all people. And more of this, okay. And here is a bit of, you know, there are several sectors that are actually making money of all of this remittance sending, because it costs quite a bit of money to send, and especially, of course, it affects the lower income people. Now, one thing, I'm just going to put it on the table, I'm not going to elaborate. I think one effort that I'm really getting at here is the importance of disassembling, separating the pieces in terms of the categories that we use to explain, to name, to designate. You know, we have to be very careful. I have been doing that actually throughout my lecture here. I have been disassembling, showing how just the remittances. The remittances, you know, a lot of them are coming to rich countries. They're not just all going to poor countries. Now, for me, one practice that I have is the importance of, and I've been doing that also here, of destabilizing meanings. The immigrant, I've been destabilizing the term immigrant. I have been destabilizing the term remittances, etc., etc. You know, the importance of not accepting these encompassing ways of naming. And here is, you know, here are some fancy little moments, but we can, I love this notion that powerlessness is a variable. At one end, it is elementary, you are a victim, but at the other end, there are situations where powerlessness can become complex. So I use this argument to say that when you have immigrant workers, low-wage immigrant workers in cities, they're still powerless, but there's a kind of complexity that powerlessness can acquire, where if they are on a plantation or in a mine, very difficult for powerlessness to be complex. You are really oppressed there. So the importance of certain spaces, back to the spaces, the city is a critical space in that regard. I think of the city today as being a frontier space. The frontier is no longer at the edges of empire, as it was. It's inside our cities. And the frontier for me is a space where you have an encounter between actors from different worlds, for which there are no established rules of engagement. Was that clear? So in that sense, the city is a critical space for all these mixes, where a city can handle it much better than than a plantation, than a sort of a uniform or an office park. The migrants who work the immigrants who work in an office park, what an office park is? Just a complex of buildings that is privately controlled. They have zero power on as workers. Whereas if they're working inside the city, a city is sort of, whatever there is, it's just it's a less controlled space. There is something that can happen. To me, this is extremely important. So when I was back with my women there when we were all cleaning, we had a bit of freedom because we were working in smaller spaces. It was like embedded in the city. It was not a private office park. When I look at all of these different conditions, I see these differences. Now, I think I'm going to actually keep at this. I want to begin to wrap it up, and I want to come back to today. So what I have described to you is something that, again, from the perspective of the United States, when you say the migrant, the immigrant, these are very flattened categories. They have been flattened. What I've tried to do is to open them up, Each one of these is a variable. It can take on many, many meanings, right? The professional can also be a migrant. The migrant is not necessarily, we use the language to flatten, but when we begin to see who all is in that category. And so I want to come back to today, these emergent conditions. And I've just finished a very sort of detailed paper about these three basic flows that I was mentioning, the flows into Europe that are coming mostly from Asia, war zone, and from sub-Saharan Africa, not always war there. The Rohingya in Myanmar, 160,000 have basically escaped, so it's quite a big number in a few years. And the Central American unaccompanied children. In other words, a lot of the migration in each of these three flows, except for the Rohingya, so two flows. In the case of Europe, you have regular migrations that have been going on for a while, and then you have a new type of migration. Same thing with Central America. You've had ongoing flows of migrants, and then you have a special new. I'm interested in these emergent flows. So in the case of Europe, a lot of it is routinized migration that has been coming, etc. Some of it is not. Clearly, the refugees pushed out by war, etc., that's sort of new. Some of the Eritrea has really jumped up in, the impossibility of the regime, etc. But, there is also a lot of just standardized migration. And as I said, in Central America, same thing. A lot of standardized, and then these special migrations. So here is where I want to, sort of this final thought that I want to leave with you. So it seems to me that these particular flows that I'm emphasizing, that they are different. And here is a hypothesis that I'm working with. And it is that what we are witnessing in these last few years is an emergent migrant, and really, I think, a refugee, but as I said at the beginning, a different type of refugee. And that this is just the beginning. And we're not ready. I have tracked, in a long piece that I did, how Europe handled these migrations. And Europe has been far more generous, by the way, than the United States, who, after all, when it started bombing Iraq, got a lot of this stuff going. The United States is very guilty. Australia is very guilty. And they're sort of Saudi Arabia in its own way. So I think Europe has been very generous. I'm not criticizing Europe. But I have been, I think for me it starts November 2014. The Mediterranean, Mare Nostrum, is suspended just at the time when the flows are really increasing. Now, mind you, some of these wars, as you will know, have been going on for a very long time, but at some point, poof, they emerge. And that point is November 2014. And it's absolutely extraordinary because Syria had been in very bad shape, Iraq and Afghanistan. So, but this is also very important. Why is it at some point that suddenly it sort of scales up and it becomes a very visible condition and a very difficult to handle? Now, November 2014, the EU decides against the better judgment of the Italian government to suspend Mare Nostrum. And it was just the wrong time to do that. I don't know. Am I being too minimalist here in my explanation? Should I elaborate, or are we all on the same page? Because that is when you have this increase in people who are crossing the Mediterranean. You know, mostly at that point it is south-north, northern Africa, south, but then comes, of course, the east-west migration. And so you have the drownings, you have a lot of stuff. So I can't give you all the details. I've written about it. There are many, many steps when the EU, every time, and it was the most generous actor, I repeat, compared to the United States and to Australia, etc. But anyhow, just gets it wrong. And basically getting it wrong here means underestimating what was about to be the next, scale up. And I think right now it's evident that, that this is a very difficult moment, let me put it that way, that there are millions and millions of displaced. You all know that we have 40 countries at war. We have now 80 million recognized refugees, which is the highest that since we have the regime of UNHCR has had. It went in a few years, it really is just the last 2 or 3 years, from 60 million to 80 million. And it's just growing. And that's just one part of it. A lot of people are not counted in that. Now, it seems to me that the EU was trying heroically to handle it. And so I'm not simply criticizing here, but that we're confronting something for which our established notions of what's a migrant, what's a refugee, our established notions of how do we handle this influx, what are the conditionalities that every government who is a signatory to the UNHCR should obey by, it's just not going to work. I'm now being very brutal. It's not going to work. This is a new historic phase. This is an emergent condition. Now, I have given you at least I tried, to show to you how ambiguous the language is that we have used just with traditional migration. So something that we have been studying, must be 1 million experts on migration just in Europe and in North America. I mean, it's battalions of people studying it. And there's always something that we're not getting, and something that we're not getting. Here is my concern. Right now, the way we are interpreting what is happening is not going to work, no matter the good intentions. If we have 80 million recognized displaced people, we know for a fact that there are millions and millions in each of these countries that are at war or in trouble, again, 40 countries. So we have to do some very radical rethinking. And I think that we haven't even considered what I started out with, this notion that there's a new kind of migrant who is also a refugee, but a refugee from economic and climate change conditions. That's shorthand. So we, on the one hand, I think we need to learn from the past, what I tried to do very briefly here. Who is the migrant anyhow? Very variable subject. And that, for instance, one small empirical way to show that in today's condition is that many of the Syrians are have a higher level of education than the countries that are receiving them. They are absolutely extremely highly educated. So are many of the Iraqis, so are many of the Afghanis. We cannot flatten them. It's like the doctor who's working in a parking lot that I mentioned. The communities where they are should know, we poor Americans, poor American communities have zero medical support, basically. Obama has helped a bit, but we have this knowledge here. We need to begin to reposition and value what they bring. This is very important, I think. But my main concern is, and this is what I'm working on, and I just want to leave it with you as a thought, and if you have any thoughts about it, I would love to receive some email, etc. I think we need to develop a regime that holds the big mining companies, the Nestle's and Coca-Colas who are exhausting the underground water supply in more and more parts of the world. You know that Coca-Cola managed to do that in India, in 2 regions. 0 water left, 0. They have to truck it in. The government has to truck it in. And as a footnote, Coca-Cola was using, and they don't pay anything, you understand, the big water reservoir that we have for New York City. And they take it, I mean, it's like an endless amount that they take out. And the government of New York State said, Coca-Cola, you're out. And they went to California, where they were just, which has a super drought, I don't know if you have heard of it, and they were discovered, they were just extracting water. So was Nestle and Coca-Cola. There are a few other companies. And I describe all of that in my expulsions book. So we have got to develop regimes that govern these extremely destructive major actors who are moreover going to create and are already creating significant displacements of people for whom we don't have a language. How do we call them? What are they? Are they climate change victims? That sounds a bit too ambiguous. You know, we need to nail it down more. And they are going to migrate because they are losing habitat at a rate that is extraordinary. And I already, at the beginning, I mentioned the expansion of cities, the building of gated communities, mining, plantation agriculture, which destroys the land very quickly as opposed to smallholders, so they need more plantation. When you put it all together, you can see that this notion that I sort of put it under, you know, a massive loss of habitat, that is going to be a very significant factor, and we don't have a regime. So one of my efforts right now is how do we begin to develop accountability? Huh? They are responsible. And this has gotten worse and worse. So one of the last chapter in this new book I call Dead Land, Dead Water. Totes Land, sagt man das? So I say climate change, it's far too vague. Let's name it. And this is actually something, you know, that, I mean, in Europe is quite extraordinary how it has protected, you know, what we call nature. I say it in quotation marks because it's a very problematic term. But, you know, you are really... But most other parts of the world, they're not that way. They're just not. And Nestle, of course, is not extracting water in Europe, or in Switzerland, let's say, like it does throughout the whole rest of the world. So when I look at this current migration, yes, the war is the main factor. I mean, that's where most of the migrants come from. But there is another emergent history, a history in the making, that is going to just overwhelm us because the numbers could potentially be very, very high. And I think that among the migrants who are coming now from, I mean, to some extent also from Afghanistan, Iraq, by the way, they're not all escaping war. There are other issues, but certainly from Africa. You know, it's loss of habitat. And we are seeing that we're seeing that in Mexico. We're seeing that in Central America, a variety of reasons. So that is sort of my call. You know, that we need to enrich the language through which we understand what is happening. The migrant or the immigrant, the refugee is not enough. And as I try to show, when we just think about immigrants, they are so diverse. There are so many different features that, you know, this is a rather complex story, and we may want to begin to discern, you know, make differences, etc. And so with that very unhappy thought, I leave you. Thank you. I'm going to migrate right now. No. Thank you very much.